Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome. I'll start off the event by introducing our author today, the author of the book that we're going to be discussing. Maria Abranches is a social anthropologist based in the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia in the UK. Her main area of research over the past 15 plus years has been migration, but she's also interested in the anthropology of food. This combination of interests led to the book that Maria will be talking about today, Food Connections, Production, Exchange and Consumption in West African Migration, published by Berghahn this year. Maria has carried out research in Portuguese-speaking African countries, Guinea-Bissau and Angola, and has co-edited a book on food and migration with Diana Mata Codesal, Food Parcels in International Migration, Intimate Connections, which was published by Palgrave in 2018. We'll put a link up for that book there, which Haneen is going to do now. Maria is currently leading a British Academy funded project on the lived experience of refugee families in the UK. She has recently become interested in creative and arts-based methods of research, and she has used collage, photography and film in her research. She's also currently leading a museum-university partnership in Norfolk, which involves working with local museums to disseminate research on migration and promote migrants' contributions to life in the region. So without further ado, Maria, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Haneen, as well, and to the Royal Anthropological Institute for giving me the opportunity to present my book and for hosting this launch. I am going to now share my screen to show you the slides for this presentation. Okay. Hopefully that's working. Looks good, yeah. So I am going to start this presentation with a brief story that illustrates how the research that led to the book came about. Then I'm going to introduce to you the fieldwork and the context of the research, and I will finally present the main contributions of the book, which I've divided into three key areas that are anthropological concerns and that I hope the book gives some new insight into. And these are temporalities, materialities, and economies. So I will present them in turn, although they all intersect and influence each other. So the book starts with the story of two brothers, one in Guinea-Bissau and one a migrant in Portugal, who I met during fieldwork in these two countries. And it was with their own story of migration in the late 1980s that the demand for homeland food was identified amongst Guinean migrants, as you can see in these quotes. And with them started the small-scale transnational circulation of food between Guinea-Bissau and Portugal that I explore in the book. This image here at the center shows the area in Lisbon where the two brothers started selling Guinean food. It's an area in central Lisbon near the river, connected to the periphery by direct train and ferry. And it is, since the first flows of Guinean migration, an important space of food exchange and socialization for Guinean migrants. And this is partly because of the history of that building that you can see there at the back of the image, which used to be the Disabled War Veterans Association and is now the Palace of Independence. And after the end of the Independence War, many of the first Guineans who started to migrate were of Fula origin, who, like the migrant brother in this second quote here on the right, had negotiated with the Portuguese as intermediaries between the local population and colonial authorities. So when they arrived in Portugal, they came to this association in search of a pension, which, however, they never received, but they continued to use this space, and it's still used until now, as you can see in the quote on the right. So it was an important space in my fieldwork. The book follows the close-knit lives of mainly urban farmers from their production sites in Bissau, where they harvest the crops and transport them to the local food markets and storehouses, where food is also shared. It also follows a variety of intermediaries who are responsible for packing and transporting the food packages to the airport. Some of these intermediaries are known as agencia, which I translate as transnational agencies, and I will say a bit more about them later. It then follows the journey of food through spaces of travel, such as the airports of Bissau and Lisbon, where the packages depart and where they arrive, mostly through the help of carriers. So carriers are passengers who are asked to carry an extra bag with food, and they are often compensated monetarily for taking that role. And I will say more about these roles later too. And it ends in the spaces of exchange in Lisbon, which are small shops and street markets, and a mobile selling initiative, to which I'll come back at the end as well, and also in spaces of food preparation and consumption. So production, exchange, and consumption of food are connected in various ways in Guinea-Bissau, and the book explores all of these. So ways that are embedded in meanings and uses of land, notions of territory, ethnicity, and religion, perceptions and experiences of health and illness, livelihoods and practices of solidarity and obligations that relate to food gifting and sharing, but also to its trade for economic gains. So a question that I'm interested in answering with the book is what changes in those connections when physical distance is imposed by migration? And why does this matter? Well, although food and migration are both central in West African economic and social life, their relationship is still very little understood, unlike in other regional contexts. So my intention to study this relationship derived from the recognition that anthropology can really contribute to understand these connections, and therefore also the way the realities and everyday experiences of migrants and their home-based kin are connected. So here are some examples of studies of food and migration, first in other regional contexts, although they are mostly centered on consumption at the destination side only. Some exceptions also here to the limited attention given so far to the relationship between food and migration in studies of Africa, and especially lacking are studies that look at both sides of the migration. There has certainly been an interest in the social aspects of food, but not so much in how migration affects these. While exploring these connections in the book, I adopt an approach that is influenced by an anthropological use of phenomenology, where people's realities are made of their understanding of things like food and the meaning they give to them, as well as of how they experience them. So this is partly influenced by the work of Kalpana Rum and Christopher Houston and others who have looked at the use of phenomenology in anthropology. And I look at meanings and materialities of food and food-related practices that connect people in the two countries, which includes adaptations that are needed to make sense of a new reality in the country of destination. Now, just a brief contextualization and history. If you're not familiar with the country, Guinea-Bissau is a small West African country on the coast with an estimated population of about 1.9 million people. And it's extremely diverse despite its small dimensions. It has considerable ethnic and language diversity. In Bissau, the capital, where most of my fieldwork was conducted, vegetable gardens can be seen built between built areas, and swamp areas used for agricultural land start to dominate the landscape as soon as one moves away from the center towards the peripheral neighborhoods, where spontaneous food markets have also expanded. So these agricultural activities were initially a response to the socioeconomic challenges that resulted from a history of poor economic and agricultural policies. But they are now also a response to a new demand for homeland food from the diaspora, which is dependent of urban production in the case of fresh crops because of the proximity to the airport. The first flow of Guinean migration to Portugal happened after the country's independence from Portugal in 1973 and Portugal's return to democracy the year after. But the largest flows occurred between the 1980s and 1990s due to a growing labor demand in the construction sector, which most migrants integrated. And this is the period when one of the two brothers who introduced the book also migrated. This period was characterized by the informalization of the sector, the construction sector, where illegal paid work was being tolerated to meet the demand. And therefore, most Guinean migrants, who were then mainly men, entered the sector in irregular and precarious employment conditions. And this led them to initiate self-regulated activities, such as the transnational trade of homeland food, which continue to this day. These activities have in the meantime been taken over by women, who now comprise half of the Guinean population in Portugal, although men are also still involved, and most of these are family businesses. The economic and financial crisis that started in 2007, 2008 aggravated migrants' job insecurity in the years that followed and generated a lack of jobs in the construction sector. So some of the Guineans I met in 2009, 2010, when I was doing fieldwork, had to turn almost entirely to food trade. Guineans are the fifth largest group of non-EU nationals in Portugal, and the majority live in Lisbon and its periphery. And there seems to be some selectivity in terms of migrants' ethnic groups, although these are only estimates. So the only study so far that looked at this diversity amongst Guinean migrants was conducted in the 1990s, when the Fula, Manjaco, Mandinga and Mancanya were the majority. But this actually also corresponds to what I found in the field in Lisbon. And this distinction is important in the book because food is an important signifier of people's sense of belonging at different levels, which are complex and layered rather than linear. So although I use the concepts of ethnicity and ethnic groups in the book, I also critically discuss their problematic nature and the role played by colonialism and power relations in Africa in shaping them, with some scholars of Guinea-Bissau and Guinean scholars arguing that the colonial imposition of territorial borders forced people to integrate a solid physical unity that was exogenous to them, and others arguing that ethnicity already existed in pre-colonial times with reference to a common land of origin. In the book, I am more interested in internal perceptions of these designations. So whether imported or not, I'm interested in how people perceive and position themselves within them. An example that shows the relevance of these historical subjectivities is that the Fula were often seen by others as foreigners, by other Guineans as foreigners who came as nomads from the east in search of better trade opportunities. And they comprise the majority of Guinean migrant food traders. So as you can see in this quote here on the right, they are identified by others as more profit-oriented and less concerned or less connected to the materiality of food or to things to do with farming. So they handle the food forcefully rather than carefully, as the example in this quote. Now, the food products listed here are those that travel regularly from Guinea-Bissau to Portugal. And I've got some visual illustrations here as well. So these are the fresh vegetables that are the key ingredients in the sauces that regularly accompany rice, which is the main staple food in Guinea-Bissau. They are of urban production, the ones that travel to Lisbon, because they need to grow close enough to the airport in order to be safely shipped, because they're fresh and because there are not efficient refrigeration and transport conditions or sufficient road infrastructures. Some fruits are also sent, and mango in particular really dominates the process of food circulation and also dominates food markets in the two countries and conversations about food during its season. And other fruits are sent as dry pulp as well to be made into juices. And palm oil products and ground nuts and cashew nuts are also sent regularly. And also smoked and dried fish and seafood, often pounded and sent in these small sachets that you can see there in the middle. And these are some of the riskiest products to send because they can more easily be caught by customs at the airport. So this is indeed a risky activity, both financially, because the product may be confiscated or lost and the investment is also lost, but also emotionally, because this investment is also in relationships and there is quite a bit of tension and wariness involved in it. It's a process that relies very much on trust from both sides, and I'll come back to this as well in a moment. I also looked at other plant products that are used as medicine, or mesinho in Creole, in Guinean Creole, which are made of 3 parts. These are the ones you can see on the right. And I included them because these are products that are associated with the healing and connecting power of the land as well. And in fact, the infusion that is prepared with these products is called mesinho de terra, which can be translated precisely as medicine from the land. And here I give a privileged space to cola nuts, which also travel from Guinea-Bissau, because they are one of the food products that better illustrate how the materiality of food and the relationships it generates are connected through a shared land. So cola nut is described as an addictive stimulant fruit, as is shown in this quote, which migrants consider vital in providing physical strength and comfort in an unfamiliar environment. And also, the act of offering it symbolizes respect and is part of greeting or thanking rituals, so that sending it as a gift to migrant relatives from Bissau has particular significance too. And this is how the products are then sold in Lisbon. As you can see, they are often put in these individual sachets. For example, a combination of a handful of kanja, jagatu, and bajiki, which are 3 of the most commonly sent fresh vegetables, was quite popular and costed at the time of fieldwork €2.50, each of these little sachets. Now, let me move on to situating the contributions of the book within these 3 areas, starting with temporalities. So the book shows how food contributes to shaping futures, especially future aspirations of migration. So for people who are involved in the production side and in sending, knowing the final destination of the food they harvest or sell or prepare to be sent activates or increases their desire to migrate. And these conversations, like the one quoted here on the left, so all my crops go to Portugal, why can't I go too? These conversations were held most of the time when handling food itself. There's also a sense of connection, because by making homeland food available to their migrant relatives, they feel responsible for minimizing the risks those relatives face, especially health risks that the absence of homeland food generates. And the temporality of these connections comes also in the form of reciprocity. by sending food now, they hope to be compensated in the future. And that compensation is often expected to be in the form of support for their own projects of migration. For example, receiving help with the required documentation or money for the visa, or of support from others at home once, if they manage to migrate, as is the case in this second quote here. And then remittances, of course, are another form of compensation for this transnational food gifting practice, and the one that is most regular and continuous. It's a continuous expectation, a continuing practice that maintains these connections. Linked to these aspirations are imaginaries of migration, how people imagine spaces of migration. For the younger people I worked with in Guinea-Bissau, who were responsible for sending food to their migrant relatives, there was a clear development imaginary. So the development they hoped they would achieve with migration. And this was linked to the obstacles they faced in their own life journeys, in studying, for example. For those who had the obligation to send food regularly, this could mean spending 3 whole days a week, from morning to late in the night, selecting, buying, transporting, packing, and negotiating with carriers at the airport. And I say 3 days because at the time there were 3 weekly flights to Lisbon, and they did this on each of them. And these tasks were described as exhausting and risky, and they contributed to people's sense of coitadeza, which is a common designation in Guinean Creole of the feeling of being poor and restricted in one's opportunities. Of course, these imaginaries of development are influenced by the colonial past, which weighed also on a top-down post-independence modernization project, where the lack of opportunities for most people resulted in an erased or distorted memories and imaginaries of the past, where development is associated with a certain order and stability, which, however, was built through violence and oppression, but that violence and oppression is erased from these memories. On the other hand, there's also a widespread perception that migration also carries risks, especially health-related, which result from the distance imposed between people and their land and the food that is a part of the land. This photo here was one that I took of a couple in Portugal. And when I took it to Guinea-Bissau to show the couple's daughter and niece, they were concerned with how much their relatives had physically aged with migration. There was, in fact, also a sense that migration isn't for older people because the bodily risks were higher for them. So land has central importance in disconnections and disconnections. And chon, which can be translated as land or soil, is the substance that links people, food, and also the ancestors. Chon choma is an important embodied experience in people's life worlds that can be translated as the land is calling, literally, the land is calling, and is often used, for example, when attending funerals in villages of origin, which are occasions to return to the land of the ancestors and to reconnect. Returns, indeed, they illustrate another temporal connection. Packages of Guinean food arriving in Lisbon evoke memories of home and a longing from home. And on those occasions, return aspirations are also evoked and discussed in spaces of food performances, spaces of food exchange, spaces where food arrives, such as the airport, and spaces of food sharing and consumption. For those who are able to return, most of the time temporary returns of a few months, they're able to regain strength through food. Food is unlike the material that travels in the opposite direction from Lisbon to Bissau, so construction material, electronic equipment, etc. food is not associated with development. Exogenous food at the destination, which Guineans often refer to as white people's food, is not seen as more developed at all. On the contrary, it is the endogenous organic methods of production in Guinea-Bissau that allow for the connection between food and land to be kept, making it preferred. This is interesting also because of more current widespread discourses on organic and local food as healthier and more ethical. So actually we can see that on the one hand, the positionality of these perceptions and experiences can bring different life worlds closer in some ways than we sometimes imagine, like the preference for organic food. But also, on the other hand, and in relation to the preference for local food, it's important to say that migrant voices and choices are often absent from these discourses of eating local. And they can therefore create inequalities and exclusions when they don't take into consideration situations where preserving food culture, so bringing that food to migrant spaces, is actually vital for the well-being of people. So for return migrants, although most stories of performances of success use those other materials they bring from Portugal that I was referring to, so the construction and electronic materials, and Eric Gable is an anthropologist who has explored this extensively in Guinea-Bissau, for example. But they can also perform success through food. And this quote here on the left is from a returned migrant that illustrates a situation where distributing food to the children in the neighborhood, in this case, was a performance of success. Another way in which temporalities matter is through the experiences of mobility and stillness. So mobility has been given a central position in studies of migration and has tended to be associated with a modern landscape where everything seems to be on the move at a larger scale with a faster temporality, although scholars have more recently also started to be concerned with immobility. But by exploring the transnational mobility of food and not just of people, the book shows that stillness and waiting, the sitting together while recreating the land through familiar smells and tastes and shared memories and making plans, are an equally important experience. Jumbai, in this quote here, means precisely the practice of sitting and being together, and is part of the experience in spaces of food exchange and consumption, both in Guinea-Bissau and in Portugal. Some forms of mobility also involve the desire for permanence. Migrants' plans to or desire to permanently return are a good example of this. And an understanding of mobility that focuses on movement only and idealizes that movement is not always appropriate in the context of Guinea-Bissau and as elsewhere in Africa, as others have also noted. So the dailiness of food practices, such as sharing food in spaces of socialization and exchange, provides food with a key role in temporalizing people's realities, connecting the past, present, and future through memories and projects and aspirations. Food is a provider of temporal rhythms, as David Sutton has argued, and food-related practices of buying, preparing, and eating structure not just everyday routines, but also long-term life projects. Okay, so moving on to materialities. As I said, separation from the land and its substance, the same substance that constitutes food, carries health-related risks of bodily weakening and illness. And some people described the experience of the body rejecting unfamiliar foods through sickness and nausea. So a sense that food is incompatible with the body because of its disconnection with the land. Homeland food is therefore important to allow for a link to be kept between the person and the land, and as a consequence to offer bodily protection against illness and also against gossip, jealousy, and jamfer, which is a practice that is intended to harm others and can be situated within the wider critical debate on African witchcraft, but I prefer to use the local term jamfa. And the land and related objects and practices can protect against these. Food, but also other objects from the land, such as messinho, the plant medicines I mentioned earlier, and amulets, have an important mediation role here between spiritual power and religious power and human agency in order to help migrants and their home-based kin make sense of the world within the disjuncture that migration brings. Food also allows for connection during important rituals that, with migration, have to be performed in two separate spaces. Ramadan and the breaking of the fast is an example of these ritual connections where food helps to make sense of the world. So during Ramadan, women get together to prepare moni, which is a dish made of millet, sugar, and water that is typically consumed for breaking the fast, where the millet flour is mixed with water until small round grains are formed, like the ones on the image here on the right. And so the experience of sitting together around the basins with flour, the familiar sensations from the mixture, and the certainty that this same ritual was being performed simultaneously by relatives in their places of origin, in the villages of origin, brings a sense of comfort and connection. Also, some families managed to have large quantities of pounded millet sent directly by their relatives from the villages of origin in Guinea-Bissau, so that they could have enough available for the duration of the month of Ramadan. And on the left image here, those bags that you can see in the background had 25 kilos of pounded millet, which had been brought by a fellow villager recently arrived in Portugal, who was being temporarily hosted by this family during Ramadan. Now, because not all food is available with migration, there is a need to adapt. And here I draw on Meredith Barker's notion of originality rather than a search for authenticity. So, for example, when millet wasn't available to prepare moni, corn was used without it being seen as a diminished experience at all. So food is adapted through preparation techniques. The most common examples are preparing sauces, like caldo branco, which is made with homeland chili and gives a familiar spicy and sour taste to exogenous food. And the others like caldo de chibeng, which is made with palm oil, caldo de mancara, made with groundnuts, or baguete, which is made of kanja and jagatu, two of the most commonly sent fresh vegetables. So all these sauces help endowing food with a Guinean taste and value. Smoking the fish and grilling the corn, as it is done at home, is also an adaptation practice, even though the fish and the corn are exogenous in nature. So food is given familiar taste and value through consumption practices as well as preparation practices, such as sharing meals in spaces of sociability. And these new food realities created through adaptation are transformed into a new reality where protection continues to be granted. So people have an active role in giving meaning to food and transforming that meaning into a lived reality that makes sense to them. These photos here illustrate some of the new food-related encounters that occur. In this case, between a Portuguese mobile seller of products like potatoes and onions and a Cape Verdean fish vendor, both of whom sell to a Guinean clientele. Corn is also bought usually from Cape Verdean women sellers, but all these products are made Guinean once they are prepared and shared in Guinean ways. The same material adaptation also happens with objects that are used as medicines, as well as amulets for healing and protection. and that, as I said, I also explore in the book, although they are not at the center of the analysis. But just to give an example, for Guinean migrant Muslim healers, the main power of their healing practice came from what is called scrita, which can be translated as writing, and is materialized in Quranic inscriptions written on paper and put in small leather sackets, the amulets, that are then used close to the body. The difficulty here was that proximity to Guinean land was often required. For example, when the illness or the problem that the patient suffers from requires that the charms or the amulets be buried under the fire where women cook, or at the entrance of the patient's house on the ground, the soil, in order to benefit from the land's strength. And this can't be done in spaces of migration away from home. So adaptation in these situations requires creativity, as this Guinean migrant healer says here in this quote. And the solution often was that the ritual was performed partly in Lisbon and partly in Guinea-Bissau with the help of another healer there, who does the part of the ritual that cannot be performed away from the land. Now, what do these connections that the book explores tell us about economies? First, they add a third realm to the community and impersonal realms of the economy put forward by Stephen Goodman, and that's the materiality of the exchange. When the exchange concerns food, even if it is performed transnationally through several intermediary levels, the process is influenced in unique ways by the distinctiveness of the food substance that results from the connection with the land, so that a connection is maintained between consumption and production, even when there is geographical distance. This connection is also influenced by the materiality of spaces of exchange and consumption and conviviality, with the aromas and rhythms that reproduce home, and where the actual spatial layout is also reproduced, with sellers, for example, occupying fixed positions in street markets, using similar materials, so cardboard, plastic crates, or old tins of paint to sit down and arrange the products for display, and with services nearby created to serve their needs, such as bars and restaurants and mosques. This quote here illustrates product specialization in those spaces, where vendors specialize in particular types of food. These material elements of the exchange are similar in both countries, except that in the area of central Lisbon, introduced by the two brothers that I spoke of initially, the exchange is sometimes more covert due to occasional police intervention, and there is obviously some anxiety involved in the need to keep guard. Sometimes impersonal rather than community forms of exchange are actually preferred in people's negotiations as food sellers and customers, because of the conflict and tension that might result from community obligations, especially when these are broken. So, for example, Chinese migrants who have long established commercial activity in Lisbon have redirected some of that activity towards an African clientele. They named their shops African shops, as that one in the picture, employed Guinean shopkeepers, and complicated the level of intermediaries by buying Guinean produce in bulk from Guinean migrants who have it sent from Bissau, and then selling it to other Guineans, who then sometimes still resell the produce. This system is sometimes preferred by Guineans because it avoids the risk of conflict that also arises from community-based systems of credit and debt, which can ultimately lead to a lack of payment. And they felt that by negotiating with Chinese migrants, payment was in some ways more guaranteed. And it is also used, this system is also used by more recently arrived migrants who don't have yet the necessary social networks and financial capital to have the produce sent directly from Bissau to them. So, for example, some of them would buy small quantities of Guinean products from these Guinean shops or from other fellow Guineans, and then use them to prepare, for example, juices that they would then sell in these street markets, so at a smaller scale. A previous experience of migration by the person responsible for sending from Bissau was considered important by Guinean migrant traders, although it wasn't always possible. But in their view, knowing through experience the economic difficulties that migrants go through, rather than having this image of wealth that Europe conveys to those who have never left, was an incentive to keep the agreement, as is explained by a shop owner on the quote here on the left. If conflicts occurred, Guinean food vendors in Lisbon could change their provider, and in some cases, relationships were terminated. And some then started buying the produce from other migrant vendors who, by managing to receive larger quantities, also acted as intermediaries. Another food vendor in Lisbon illustrates this in this other quote here on the right, where the loss of money, but also of trust and sense of security is emphasized in his experience as migrant, not just in the food trade business, but also in the construction sector. So, but even though there may be extra layers of intermediaries or breaches of trust between different actors, the connection between production and consumption of Guinean food is not removed, due precisely to the distinctiveness of the materiality of food and its capacity for maintaining the body connected to home and to the land. So a shared knowledge of the technical and cosmological elements of production in Guinea-Bissau, and of a knowledge also of the process of circulation and exchange, including of its multiple levels, helps to overcome the increased distance and minimize the disruption, and allows for production knowledge to be maintained. These practices and meanings related to food exchange also contribute to blur the boundaries between gifts and commodities, which anthropology has often demonstrated. So although the increase in the demand for homeland food generated by migration has created opportunities for economic gains, gifting practices have not been eliminated. And because there is a moral obligation to share food, it's often hard to distinguish between gifts and loans of food, for example, when often repayment is transformed into perpetual debts, like I said before, and as this quote from a food seller in Lisbon here also illustrates. And a lot of people send food gifts regularly to their migrant relatives, as I also said before, partly expecting a future compensation that is often sent in the form of remittances, which also shows how opposing a spontaneous spirit of gifts to a calculated spirit of commodities is an oversimplification, as others have noted. And a critical note here on how these forms of livelihood integrate the informal economy. So just to contextualize, small trade, and specifically food trade, is the most common source of income in Bissau, which has seen an opportunity to expand slightly with migration and the growing demand for Guinean food that the two brothers that I started this presentation with identified at first. This demand has allowed for new roles to be created in these economies. For example, bideiras, who are the women food sellers in Guinea-Bissau, they were able to sell larger quantities that are regularly ordered in bulk. And then transnational agencies were created. These are usually family-run partnerships that include at least one relative in each country and specialize in facilitating the sending and receiving of food in one direction and remittances, both financial and material, in the other direction. And some migrants have specialized in smoking fish and chicken for selling, for example. New intermediary roles were also created in the airport spaces, the carriers, and others who in Guinea-Bissau play a role in allowing the travel of food. And one family specialized in a mobile food selling activity in one of Lisbon's peripheral neighborhoods, which had little access to shops and street markets. It's important to say, however, that although all these activities were created as an opportunity for additional income, they are mostly a strategy for survival. And often, as I said before, some of these activities can actually create obstacles in the life projects of especially younger generations. They result partly from the experience of being excluded from the regular market, both in Portugal and in Guinea-Bissau. So a double exclusion for migrants. And they can help us to critically understand how formality and informality are also linked. The airports are spaces that materialize these linkages in unique ways. So, for example, airport members of staff in Bissau sometimes acted as intermediaries in negotiating with potential carriers as well. And they performed this task in exchange for a payment. So while some senders tried to find carriers themselves to avoid having to pay for this, although the carrier also receives a payment, others preferred to use those intermediaries in order to minimize the risk and also the fatigue and anxiety involved in this particular stage of the circulation of food. Because the flights to Lisbon happened at the time late at night, the three nights a week, this stage ended a long way of negotiations that started early in the morning in the markets and with agencies and storehouses, the packing, etc. And it was described as the most laborious and tense. Also because senders were at this stage dependent on the airport staff's roles within these formal-informal linkages, these informal activities that could result in sanctions through performances of control, especially if there had been a breach of trust and if someone had not kept their part of the agreement. So, for example, on my first trip to the airport one night, they were banning non-passengers from entering the airport, which meant that the senders of food could not get in to find carriers. And rumors had it that night that it had to do with a broken agreement, because agreements are usually made between individuals and they have to be kept. And this broken agreement resulted in this sanction performed by the airport staff. And therefore, it resulted in the loss of fresh food and of the investment made for all senders that night. Migrants on temporary returns talked about how they preferred to be at the receiving end of the food's journey and dwelling in the airport of Lisbon instead, which they described as a more pleasurable and acceptable experience, even though it also involved long waiting and tension resulting from having to identify unfamiliar carriers. And sometimes the packages would not arrive or they wouldn't find them. So we can see how social relations and networks created outside formal institutional regulations can sometimes be used creatively, but they can also be juxtaposed with the desire to eliminate the adverse conditions of informal work. A concrete example of these linkages is an activity known by Guineans as the cargo system. And it was led by a small group of people in the two countries that cooperate both with the informal courier system and with TAP's official air cargo services and agricultural inspection. TAP is the airline that operates between Guinea-Bissau and Portugal in order to safely ship people's food parcels. So they charged for these services, making this system more expensive for senders, but sometimes also preferred because of the formal elements that minimized the risk. Then the family who is at the receiving end of this system in Lisbon receives a large amount of food themselves through this cargo system that left Bissau on a Friday night. So this was done once a week. It left Bissau on a Friday night, arrived in Lisbon the Saturday morning, and then this family distributes that food weekly on Sundays with a van in one of Lisbon's peripheral neighborhoods. This is the mobile selling activity I mentioned earlier. And for the young men who was at the time of fieldwork responsible for this activity, which had started with his mother, it was also a way to connect with others and with the land, as he says here on this quote on the right. So this is quite a different narrative here from the young people in Guinea-Bissau who felt that their involvement in these activities created constraints rather than opportunities to their lives. Okay, I'm going to finish now with a quote that I also finished the book with by Teresa Montenegro, which emphasizes precisely the connection between all things of the land, which she has named the things of the world, and that, as I argue in the book, can be better understood through an approach that doesn't separate the experiences of those things or of the world from the meanings that people give to them. So this is a phenomenological oriented approach that links the meanings people attribute to food to their concrete experiences of food production, exchange, and consumption across borders. And it can help us to better understand everyday concerns, engagements, imaginaries, aspirations, and expectations, as well as the obstacles faced in reconnecting a life world that has been geographically disconnected, both for migrants and their home-based kin. This approach also responds to some of the criticism that studies of migration and transnationalism have received for focusing on links and connections rather than on the actual experiences of people's lives. So in the book, I have focused on meaning and experience to understand, to address those connections with food, this unique material that shares its substance with people at the center. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was really, really wonderful. And thank you for all the lovely, colourful images as well. It really brought everything to life and you can almost taste the food. It was incredible. Taste it and smell it. I really look forward to hearing what our discussant has to say on all these incredible issues that Maria's talked about. Before I invite Michelle to comment on Maria's wonderful book, let me just introduce you to her this afternoon. So our discussant is Michelle Johnson. Michelle is Associate Dean of the Faculty for the Division of Social Sciences and a Professor of Social Anthropology in the Department of Critical Black Studies at Bucknell University in the United States. She is a social anthropologist specializing in religion and ritual in Africa and the contemporary African diaspora. She has conducted extensive fieldwork in Guinea-Bissau and most recently with Ghanaian immigrants in Portugal. She has held grants from the Social Science Research Council, the US Department of Education, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. In 2019, Michelle was awarded Bucknell University's 1956 Lectureship for Inspirational Teaching. Her articles have appeared in many journals, and she is the author of a 2020 publication called Remaking Islam in African Portugal, Lisbon, Mecca, Bissau, published by Indiana University Press. And I think Haneen will put up a link to that book, as she will for the next one, which is an edited volume that Michelle edited with Edmund Sales, called Reciprocity Rules, Friendship and Compensation in Fieldwork Encounters, published by Lexington Books in 2021. I'm particularly fascinated by all the issues around reciprocity that come up in your book, Maria. So I'm really, really fascinated about what Michelle, from her own experience and knowledge about reciprocity between Portugal and Guinea-Bissau, will bring out. So Michelle, I will hand over to you now.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, from my side of the Atlantic, and good afternoon from your side. I'd first like to thank Haneen, Emma, and Maria for the invitation to serve as discussant for this exciting book launch. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, even if contained in my little Zoom box. Accepting this invitation felt like an extra special privilege to me, considering that Maria and I share not one, but 2 field sites. Also in August 2021, I accepted my new position as Associate Dean of Faculty for the Social Sciences at Bucknell. And since then, I've had to work a bit harder than usual to make time to engage in those activities that scholars love best, reading, thinking, and writing about compelling new research in and beyond our fields of specialization. Although I've been unable to accept every invitation that has come my way over the past year, I knew I had to find a way to accept this one, no matter the logistical constraints or demands on my time. I will say that reading Food Connections cover to cover, taking copious notes on it, 21 handwritten pages to be exact, and crafting these short discussant remarks were for me highlights of the past 2 weeks. In the end, the biggest challenge was to keep my remarks to 15 minutes. I first thought I had 10, and I learned yesterday I have 15, given all the book's merits. So in the spirit of that challenge, I will get right to it. One of the many strengths of Maria Abranches' multi-sided, in-depth exploration of food and migration in Guinea-Bissau and Portugal is its theoretical orientation. Drawing inspiration from scholars such as Heidegger, Bourdieu, Merleau-Ponty, and Stoller, Abranches adopts a phenomenological-oriented approach, one that is historically situated, ethnographically grounded, and focused on the everyday experiences that render people's lives meaningful. Scholarly work on food and migration are relatively rare in the literature, and those that keep, quote, actual individual experiences rather than abstract ties at their core, unquote, as Abranches herself puts it, are even rarer. The academic literature on food in Africa tends to focus on the more usual themes of famine, food insecurity, and health, often downplaying or even ignoring altogether the cultural aspects of food and eating and their implications for identity and mobility. Works addressing food and migration also tend to be set in a single locale, either the sending or the receiving country, are based on relatively short periods of field work and often rely on surveys or interview-based research. Dozens of works, for example, highlight the one-directional movement of remittances from host country to homeland without addressing how these might be reciprocated in another, perhaps less readily observable form. In the case of Abranches' study, of course, we read about parcels of homeland food and medicine. Food Connections is a very different project in so many ways. The book is based on long-term ethnographic research conducted in not one, but 2 field sites, and Abranches divides her time equally between Guinea-Bissau and Portugal. While other scholars' paths toward transnational research, my own included, were often forged for them due to logistical constraints such as civil wars, in her case, multi-sided ethnography was a conscious choice from the very beginning. Her methodology comprised close ethnographic observations, conversations, and interviews with dozens of different kinds of research participants from a variety of ethnic groups. Most noteworthy, perhaps, was that Abranches herself moved with her performance, or her research participants rather, in and across the two countries, exploring the topics of food and migration from all angles and in a variety of different cultural spaces. The farms in which homeland food is produced, the markets in which it is purchased and sold, the airports at which it is sent or received, and the restaurants and homes where nostalgic migrants consume it in Portugal. Some of the spaces in which she worked, for example, the Agência, or a small-scale family-run businesses that included at least one relative in Guinea-Bissau and Portugal and facilitates the sending and receiving of products between the two countries, are novel cultural spaces that were created by the migration process itself. In the complex transnational journey of homeland food and remittances between West Africa and Europe, experiences and meanings come alive in the writing, as Kiran Narayan puts it, through carefully crafted narratives that reveal what Abranches calls an investment in connections. I want to note another key point about methodology here, specifically the role of language in the research process. Although Guinea-Bissau is known as a Lusophone or Portuguese-speaking country, fewer than 10% of the population actually speaks Portuguese. Instead, they speak Creole, the country's lingua franca, in addition to many other indigenous languages. Whereas many Portuguese and Ghanaian people I met in Guinea-Bissau and Portugal, even some scholars, had lingering colonial attitudes toward Creole, referring to it as português mal falado, or poorly spoken Portuguese. Abranches learned the language and spoke it with her research participants, which clearly enriched her understanding of the complex themes she explores in the book. This is very refreshing and demonstrates her rigor as an anthropologist and researcher. The result of the book's compelling combination of theory, methodology, and ethnographic writing is the very best that the humanistic anthropological tradition has to offer. Readers come to understand, indeed even feel in their bodies, research participants' varied experiences in and between the local and global spaces they inhabit. For example, they feel a Ghanaian woman's profound disappointment when she learns that the parcels of fruits and vegetables that she carefully selected, purchased, and prepared to send to Portugal was detained for luggage identification at Bissau's airport, would spoil before the next flight to Lisbon and would never reach her pregnant relative in Lisbon, who so anxiously awaited the homeland food she craved and had specially requested. Readers also come to feel another Ghanaian woman's aspirations and burning desire to migrate, which were intensified by the parcels of food and medicines she sent 3 times a week to her mother in Lisbon. Readers' senses beyond sight are engaged when they read the vignette of a Ghanaian migrant woman in a Lisbon suburb who, after not eating her favorite food of pounded shrimp for more than 2 years, puts a bag of it to her nose, closes her eyes, and says, "This is Ghanaian land. It is where my body is going to return when I die." The crucial relationship between food, homeland, and identity that Abranches explores is made tangible through these and other rich narratives in the book. While Food Connections is primarily about the material processes of food production, exchange, and consumption, it does not ignore the ever-present realm of the immaterial. Indeed, Abranches makes the important point that economic processes in both homeland and host country are inherently bound up with the religious and spiritual. In my own experience conducting research in both locales, learning about the religious and spiritual lives of one's research participants is rather straightforward in West Africa, where these are front and center and publicly expressed, especially in village contexts. People would yell, "Bring your notebook, Fatumata," my Ghanaian name. "A ritual is about to take place." But this is definitely trickier in Lisbon, where religious and spiritual activities and their meanings often remain hidden underneath more readily visible political economic ones. As such, they require more work by the anthropologist to uncover, which is perhaps one of the reasons why scholarly works in diaspora settings tend to privilege secular rather than religious themes. But armed with a deep understanding of the myriad cultures and religions in the homeland, Abranches effectively avoids this trend, digging deeply to expose the interconnectedness between material and non-material realms across Guinea-Bissau and Portugal. She argues, quote, The materiality of Ghanaian food is embedded in a particularly intimate relationship with the land that connects all living things and the spirits of the ancestors, linking the experiences of production, exchange, and consumption across borders in unique ways, unquote. Abranches demonstrates that the intimate relationship between food, homeland, and identity is not severed by migration, but remains crucial in the new locale. This relationship, however, must be more intentionally and actively maintained, and food plays a critical role in bridging the physical and emotional distance imposed by migration. Considering this, producing, exchanging, and consuming homeland food are all profoundly spiritual activities at their very core, whether they occur in Guinea-Bissau or Portugal. Abranches shows, however, that although religious practices that incorporate homeland food and plants are maintained in Lisbon, they do undergo some interesting transformations, which she highlights in the book. I'll give just a couple of examples here. Readers learn that physical separation from the land of one's origin comes with significant risk for Ghanaian migrants. Foreign, heavily processed European foods weaken their body, lead to new illnesses such as diabetes, and cause impotence in men, especially during the early phases of migration. Increased inequalities in access to wealth and education or business opportunities in Lisbon also intensify jealousy, which can result in bodily harm. Muslim healer diviners in Lisbon help alleviate their clients' problems by collaborating with their leather worker colleagues at Rocio in central Lisbon to make protective amulets. While these are usually worn on the body in Guinea-Bissau, they are more commonly kept in purses or pockets in Lisbon to avoid the othering gaze of Europeans. In Lisbon, important healing rituals are also commonly divided between both countries as a way of overcoming logistical challenges in the new setting. For example, a healer may ask someone in Guinea-Bissau to perform an animal sacrifice on a patient's behalf, while the patient in Lisbon washes their body with protective medicines. Such subtle transformations in spiritual and religious practices can only be uncovered by long-term immersive ethnographic research, the very kind of research to which Abranches is clearly dedicated. If religion does not disappear in transnational spaces, nor does ethnicity, and Food Connections offers a stimulating discussion of this classic anthropological theme, beginning with the debate about whether ethnicity predated or was instead a product of colonialism. Through a thorough discussion of the region's history, as well as numerous contemporary examples, Abranches argues that ethnicity is a complex identity that is contextual, embodied, and takes on new significance in the context of migration. It surfaces, for example, in mundane encounters, such as varied ways of handling food, and we saw this a bit in the presentation she just gave. While ethnically Mancanya people are known for carefully packing vegetables for transport to Lisbon, for example, ethnically Fula people are said to simply stuff them in a bag. These contrasting styles affect the ways in which both food and the people who produce, exchange, and consume it are imagined and engaged in both field settings. Abranches found that in understanding food as a powerful symbol of identity and belonging, land and place often emerge as more important than ethnicity in shaping identities in the diaspora. Indeed, she demonstrates through detailed ethnographic examples throughout the book that migration provides a welcome opportunity to interrogate and even rethink scholarly concepts such as religion, ethnicity, territory, and the Western assumptions that underlie them. And I could go on. She also talks about cosmopolitanism, etc. I'll just highlight two brief examples here, namely Abranches' stimulating critique of the concepts of authenticity and informality. She demonstrates that homeland food in Lisbon does not necessarily need to be from Guinea-Bissau to be considered Ghanaian. While Ghanaian migrants partake in necessary food adaptations in Lisbon, such as purchasing roasted maize from Cape Verdean vendors in the suburb of Damaya, or frozen fish from local Portuguese shops, they do not cast these in terms of loss of traditional food, taste, or culture. Rather, Abranches explains that the traditional sauces they add to them, or the ways in which these foods are eaten or shared, such as from a common bowl, endow non-Ghanaian foods with Ghanaian values, placing them squarely in the category of homeland food. In a critical discussion of what anthropologists and other scholars have long referred to as the informal economy, Abranches exposes the problematic binaries this concept entails. For example, scholars often describe informality in terms of creativity and dynamism on the one hand, or as a primary source of poverty, violence, or economic collapse on the other. But Abranches argues that in practice, the boundaries between formality and informality are permeable and intertwined. Furthermore, while it is tempting to associate informality with economic processes in African settings and formality with these same processes in Europe, Abranches contends that this is clearly not the case, as informality is as much a characteristic of transnational as it is of local economic livelihoods for the Guineans with whom she worked. Indeed, she discusses the work experiences of her research participants in both sites in terms of a double exclusion. Previously excluded from the formal sector in Guinea-Bissau, where stable and lucrative work opportunities are lacking, they are pushed yet again to the fringe informal spheres of economic life in Portugal, where most consider the food trade as either a secondary or temporary means of getting by before an opportunity in the formal sector presents itself. In her analysis of these concepts, Abranches strikes an ideal balance, however, between agency and constraint. Overall, the book is a pleasure to read and presents students and scholars alike with much to think about, including the intertwined spaces of the local and the global, and the place and movement of food and culture in and between them. It also raises some important questions for future work. What about the next generation of Guinean migrants, the children and grandchildren of the people with whom Abranches worked most closely in her research? How will they view homeland food and its effects on their physical bodies and identities? And how will these compare to their parents' and grandparents' views? What about those migrants who have left Portugal to try their luck in other European countries? How will they continue to maintain the connection between food, homeland, memory, and identity with a little bit more space in between the experience of Lusophone Africa? Finally, what further challenges will climate change, food insecurity, transforming technological spheres, and increased concerns about the sustainability of global food systems have on these connections? And at this point, I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. That was great. Some really interesting insights there. I'll give Maria a chance to respond to Michelle before we turn to questions, if that would be useful for you, Maria. Whilst we're doing that, please do either pop up your hand if you have a question, and you can come on mic and ask Maria or Michelle directly your question, or you'll notice the Q&A tab, and you can pop your question in there and I will read it out for you. So either of those options. Maria, did you want to say anything quickly in response to Michelle's?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Michelle. It's an honor to have you as discussant, and that was all really, really helpful and interesting. All the things that you mentioned about the book and everything you said. I don't have, so I just perhaps want to say something about the language, which was one of the first things you mentioned, so learning the language. And she's not here to hear me, but I had a wonderful Guinean Creole teacher from the start when I started fieldwork in Lisbon, who was a friend already, so a Guinean friend who I spent a lot of time with preparing for my field trip to Bissau and speaking, practicing Guinean Creole with her. She was also my host, but her family was also my host later on in Bissau. So I was very lucky also in that regard. I could pick up on a couple of things perhaps that Michelle said while people are perhaps thinking about questions. Just one thing in terms of the changes in food habits and how this links to health and nutrition study areas as well. There's been there's been some research, and I mentioned this also in the book, that certain diseases are actually more common amongst Guineans, such as diabetes is one that my research participants talked very often about. Many of them suffered from, and it was something they were very aware of, and that had been a result of their migration and change and the change in food habits. And cardiovascular disease as well is another commonly researched illness amongst migrants. And so it's really important, you know, and at the end you opened so many interesting questions, and one of them had to do with, you know, food security and concerns with food security currently. And, you know, one of the contributions from the book, and something I wanted to give some space to think about, is how to include migrant food preferences, which are not just preferences, but are actually physically really important for them and for their well-being when we think about, you know, food security more general and how to improve that. So migration is often not taken into account in those discussions, and it's really important to look at migrants' food preferences and food needs, I would say.
Okay, well, we have a couple of questions, Maria, if that's okay. I have one myself, but I'll save it to see if we have time at the end. But we've got one from Brandon here, and then one from Hannah. So Brandon says, how is this food circulation being impacted by neighbourhood encroachment in Bissau into urban flood zones traditionally used for urban food production? Did you get that? Do you want me to read it again?
I did. Can I see it?
You should be able to see it because it's in the chat.
In the chat. Oh, okay.
How is this food circulation being impacted by neighbourhood encroachment in Bissau into urban flood zones traditionally used for urban food production? Oh, that's a long sentence, Brandon.
Okay, let me see if I get it. So how is food circulation being impacted? I'm not sure I completely get the sense, you know, the sense of the question. I don't know if it's possible for Brendan to say.
Yeah, are you able to come on mic, Brendan? And
yeah, Brendan, if you'd like to speak, just raise your hand. Yeah, great. Okay.
Oh yes,
you should be able to talk now.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
All right, I apologize for the poorly worded question.
No.
But last time I was in Bissau, we sort of took a tour of a lot of these flood zones where you get a lot of neighborhood encroachment now in these urban areas, a lot of new builds, a lot of them unregulated. And unfortunately, it's also causing a lot of, during the rainy season, a lot of destruction and loss of life. And in the past, these areas were often used in the urban areas of Bissau as food production, and now they're being taken over by homes and other construction. So I was just curious, you mentioned that a lot of what makes its way onto the plains on its way to Portugal and Lisbon are coming from these urban areas, these urban gardens. And so I was just curious if you saw any impacts based on this newfound construction in Bissau.
I get it. Not while I was there. I don't know if that perhaps there have been more recent changes in that respect. So I don't know when you were there more recently that you said you noticed it. There are several, as you probably are familiar with. So there are several areas around in Bissau and around Bissau, all the way, you know, for those of you familiar with Bissau, so from all the way sort of towards from the sort of end of the city centre in direction to the airport, so along that road on both sides of the road and a little bit further away, several areas are used. You know, there's several small holdings and small vegetable gardens that are where this food is produced. It may be I can't really say whether this has impacted upon their capacity to produce and make this food circulate to Lisbon. Not that I'm aware of, because there are, even if some of these areas might have been might have disappeared from due to that construction, there are still there's still enough that there's still enough urban production of these fresh products to make them circulate, as far as I noticed when I was last there. Perhaps it's also important to say that this is overall a relatively small scale business. So the transnational circulation of food, it is done at a relatively small scale level, so that the impact's perhaps not as big as it would have been with a bigger scale business. I don't know if that answers, Brendan, your question, but I haven't noticed any impact that I can talk about.
Thank you, Marie. Does that answer your question, Brendan?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And wonderful presentation. I just purchased my copy of the book.
Wonderful.
On the way.
Yay, well done. Good for you. Brilliant. Okay, we have a question from Hannah. Thanks for a really interesting and appetizing presentation. I'd be interested in generational differences. Do children raised in Portugal relate with food from Guinea-Bissau in the same way as their parents? Is food used to transmit a sense of belonging to Guinea-Bissau across generations?
Yeah. Thanks, Hannah. That's a really good question, one that Michelle also raised as a question that the book really opens up, something that I haven't really focused on. What I can say from what I observed, so I didn't work with children, young children. I worked with younger generations of young men and women in their perhaps 20s. I didn't work with children younger than that, although obviously I was participating in family life, so I could get a sense of how things changed between generations, but it's something I didn't really focus on. I can say that for younger people, not necessarily children, but for younger people, food from Guinea-Bissau was important, as much as perhaps for older people. And an example of that is the young man that I spoke of, who does the distribution, the mobile selling, distribution of food in a van. And he actually had come to Lisbon when he was very young with his mother, and he had not returned since. For several years he had not returned, and yet this was for him a way to maintain that connection. So this was extremely important to him. So for younger generations, I can say it's also important, so this connection to homeland food and this sense of belonging. For children who, especially perhaps for children who have been born in Portugal or have migrated very young, I suspect, as I said, this wasn't the focus of my research, but thinking about my observations, there's perhaps a difference there. And it was important for all the relatives, for the parents, to keep that connection. So family meals were mostly Guinean meals and were shared in Guinean ways, also including the children, and this was important for the parents. I remember occasions when I was with the families and with the children, when the children, for example, wanted to go. They actually would prefer and would ask to go and eat in McDonald's instead, for example. I remember this happening on some occasions. So I would say, I think picking up on this question and on Michelle's suggestion as a question that opens up new research, perhaps would be precisely to look at that with a bit more detail. What changes then in the next generation of Guineans in Portugal?
Yeah, is there a connection then, Maria, just linking to Hannah's question, a connection between, well, a generational link between the role of food, the social role of food, and the role of food as being a nostalgia for the homeland?
So
you see what I mean? So there's like for the older generation, there's a nostalgia attached to the food,
yeah.
and what they're teaching to the younger generation is the social role of food, that it brings to get people together in marketplaces, at the dinner table, whatever it may be. Is there a kind of disconnect in that, do you think?
I think it's still a way of connecting, perhaps in a different way, but it's still a way of connecting to the homeland, even though obviously children and younger people will not have that direct memory, and therefore will not trigger this nostalgia that, like you said, like it does amongst perhaps older Guinean migrants. So there's this difference, definitely. But it's still a way to feel connected to a homeland. That might be the home of your parents or of your ancestors, but it's still a way of a connection that is important for the families. But certainly in different ways, because the nostalgia is experienced obviously in different ways, not for children who do not have that memory.
Yeah, and identity as well, I suppose, isn't it? It's a
yes,
to have that identity through the food that you're eating, even as a young person. Natasha has 2 questions. Thanks, Natasha. Fascinating, thank you. Question 1. Do you have a sense of how important economically this food system is to the sending and receiving families and overall to GB?
Guinea-Bissau. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Guinea-Bissau economically.
Yeah. Good question as well. So it is. I don't have. I have a sense of how important it is. I don't have a statistical, response to that in terms of how much income that actually brings. But it is an important part of their economic lives. So especially the new, so for the women who, for the urban farmers, so for the producers, the change, so the fact that they now can sell larger quantities, and they sell in bulk, which was something that they didn't before. So before they took small parts of their harvest to the food markets, and they sell them, and they sell those. They sold those products in small quantities. What they do now is that they sell in bulk. So they collect large quantities each week, and sometimes 3 days a week, that they sell to these families directly. So it's an increased income for them, definitely. This is something often talked about, and those other women food producers in Bissau who were not involved in this transnational activity actually often spoke of the others with some sort of, that they would like to also be involved to have that sort of economic gain. But what I also, and then also for other roles that are created in Bissau, the economic activity, small economic activity. So this is diversification of livelihoods that this circulation of food generates. Like I said, these intermediary roles, the agencies that are created in Bissau as well as in Lisbon, also generate income for these families. So there's definitely a generation of income, but what I feel like I have to caution again about this. It's obviously not for them. It's still a survival strategy. It's obviously not it's obviously not a solution, and it's something they struggle with, and the difficulties are still there. But there, and also the other thing is that especially women often refer to in Bissau is that even though they may be able to gain some additional income by being involved in these transnational activities, this income is mostly used in the expenses in the extended household. So it's rarely income that they can use for their own, for their individual, that they can use individually for themselves. So that's another thing they often mention that was quite hard. And so it's obviously not a solution to issues around, poverty and lack of employment, but it is a source of income, definitely.
I'm just going to squeeze my question in between Natasha's two questions because it links directly to what you just talked about. So what you've just said, but also the last few slides that you showed us, and you were talking about blurred boundaries. I'm really curious to know about the role of food in reciprocity and how this has shifted when we're talking about diaspora. Because food brings families together. It's a really important element of reciprocity in that it connects people, and often connects people over very vast distances as well. And yet, in one of your final slides, you talked about the what's the word? The severance of ties between a brother and a sister, one in Guinea-Bissau and one in Portugal, because of that. He was sending money to her and she was sending him food, and she was taking the money and not sending the food, and they severed their siblingship because of that. So I mean, that's really, really interesting to see reciprocity in action here in a very, very different way. And what would you say, is there a link between the way that this process is being enacted to the engagement or greater engagement with a kind of capitalist way of doing things and a kind of capitalist market as opposed to a reciprocal one that we're used to?
Okay, yeah, thanks. Reciprocity is, at the center of these relationships, and is maintained throughout the process. So that actually, for the people from Bissau who are responsible for sending because there are different roles, obviously, from different activities that leads to this within this process in Bissau. Some of them are able to accumulate a little bit more economic gains, and others a bit less. But even for those who have less to gain economically, let's say, they keep. So they are part of the reason for continuing to do it is precisely because of reciprocity, and so to continue this relationship with their migrant relatives in a way that they both know at both ends they can continue to support each other in different ways. So remittances, obviously. So in a way, if people, for example, in Bissau would stop sending food because of the obstacles it creates, like these young people I mentioned, in their personal lives, then they would risk obviously not being reciprocated and not getting support from Portugal, which is very important in their lives as well. So reciprocity is kept. Now this example is not the only example of relationships that are broken because of this transnational exchange. So it does happen. There's quite a complex the discourse around the economic actually links really well with Natasha's question. So the discussion around economic gains from both sides was quite complex because Guinean migrants, like the one in the quote you're referring to, sent money to Bissau so that their relatives in Bissau could invest in food, could buy the food and then send it. But there's little way of controlling how this money is actually spent. So there were often conversations from both sides and sometimes a little bit of accusations, how the other at the other end was actually using the money. And this led, there was tension involved. I think, though reciprocity is important, there is a lot of tension involved in these relationships as well. So the money that the migrant in Bissau receives to buy food to then send to Lisbon is sometimes, so there's sometimes the perception, right or wrong, that some of that money is kept by like this quote you're referring to. So this migrant thought that his sister was actually keeping part of the money for herself. And that's created some sort of, all sorts of conflict, and could end up in terminated relationships like this one. So in a way, perhaps, yes, that has changed, that certainly interferes with reciprocity, with the, with reciprocity practices in Guinea-Bissau. So this introduction of the economic capitalist, like you say, economic side of this new business does interfere in this way with reciprocity practices. Yes, yeah.
Thanks, Maria. Natasha's second question is, this seems very dependent on flights and people moving. What do you think the impact of COVID was on migrants involved in this food system? And related, are there initiatives to grow this food somehow in Lisbon? I was also going to ask that because that's interesting. You said that they kind of Guineaize food that's bought in Lisbon, but is there a sense of the food having to come from Guinea-Bissau for it to be from Guinea-Bissau rather than being grown locally? Thanks, Natasha.
So COVID has certainly impacted. So I haven't done my research since COVID, but I kept in touch with people a little bit, and I know, so obviously COVID has impacted their activities, but mainly, so for those in Lisbon I have been in touch with, what they say is that, especially during the periods of restrictions of gatherings and people not being able to actually sit outside and sell, that was the main difficulty they refer to in relation to COVID. Also, an additional difficulty here was that in spaces where they usually gathered, these spaces of exchange and sociability, where they sat together and exchanged food and had and were together, they were not allowed to do that anymore. And not only that, but it was actually also controlled by the police. So as during the period of more severe restriction, COVID-related restrictions, and so there was a double concern there, that not only they couldn't actually sit and sell and share food, but also they could be caught by the police more often than they used to, because these places weren't so much controlled, before. In relation to how much food can travel, so I don't know of any initiatives to grow food in Lisbon, not that I know of. And I do know food still, they still, except from when flights were completely, have completely stopped, they are still now managing to send enough food that they can continue this, connection, but certainly with more difficulty, especially perhaps now it's a bit less, but with a bit more difficult during the more sort of severe period of the pandemic. But initiatives to grow the food, not that I know of, but it would be, I would be really interested in finding out if there are any.
Thanks, Maria. There's a comment from Suvi. Thanks, Suvi, for your comment. Suvi from Finland. And we have a question from Brandon. Wonderful, another question from Brandon, the same Brandon. Wonderful presentation. It made me miss GB foodstuffs. I find it fascinating that the largest export commodity, cashews, has limited integration in GB's foodways. Did you find much circulation of cashews or cashew byproducts to Lisbon? Why or why not? I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, definitely. So cashew nuts are sent very much, as well as the other products that I mentioned. So I also mentioned cashew nuts, sorry, between between the others. So as you say, I think cashew nuts is quite unique because, like you say, it's actually the largest export exported product, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most important in Guineans' foodways, and not, you know, and not therefore not the most important for Guinean migrants either. So I'd say in terms of regularity of and quantity of food that circulates, there is more of the fresh vegetables. Those are the ones that are really sent regularly every three at the time it was 3 days a week, whereas cashew nuts were sent a bit less in comparison. But that's because also the fresh vegetables are really essential in transforming in adaptation practices that I mentioned of exogenous food. So they're used to make the sauces every day that Guineans use in their everyday practices of commensality and preparing food. So those sauces are in a way more important because of the way they can help these food adaptations, perhaps more than cashew nuts. But they're definitely, you know, they do definitely circulate and can be found very much in Lisbon markets as well. Small scale between in this.
So is there quite a lot of trade in terms of Lisbon trading directly with Guinea-Bissau and using products?
Not in large scale. So actually, and funnily enough, cashew nuts, like Brandon says, are the largest export commodity, but not so much to Portugal. So it's exported mainly to other places. It was India at a time, mostly, but not so much to Portugal. So, and there's not an export. There's not an export.
But there's no natural connection, like trade connection between the two countries. No. Okay, thank you. A little earlier on, Aini did make a comment saying, could the title of this lecture be Cargo Cults? Which I found quite interesting, because my area of research is Melanesia, so I found that to me there's no connection here between the kind of cargo cult as we understand it in the Melanesian context and the cargo that you were talking about. I don't know if you want to touch on that a bit, Maria. Amy said, could this lecture be titled Cargo Cult? I think that
cargo. I see.
Yeah, it popped up after the slide on cargo.
Yeah. I get, well, I mean, it's a really interesting example, but it's, you know, it's one example. So what the cargo, they call it the cargo system, is this one particular activity where you know, which is unique in the sense that it, like I said, exemplifies how the formal and informal are really clearly juxtaposed. So in the sending, in these performances of sending food and the processes of sending food, but it's perhaps one example of one economic activity that was, again, also it was created and emerged out of this homeland demand for Guinean food, Guinean demand for homeland food.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that there's a lot of particularly cult activity that is emerging out of this desire for or this perception of food arriving, is there? I didn't get that from, I mean, it's a very different kind of situation to what we understand in the cargo cult situation in Melanesia. Right. Okay, that's all the questions. Thank you so much to everybody who asked a question, joined in the discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. You can see the emails the messages that have popped up in the chat from Amanda. For those of you, if you're not a member of or a fellow of the RAI, please do consider joining. It's a wonderful network of social anthropologists, and there's lots of events going on like this, almost on a weekly basis, and lots of wonderful conferences, annual RAI conferences as well. So please do consider becoming a fellow. And that really just leaves me to say huge thanks to both Michelle for joining us from the US as discussant, and of course to Maria for such a wonderful presentation of what looks like an absolutely fascinating book. So join me. I'm going to clap live, and if you can join me, do turn on your microphone. Well done. Look at all those claps floating up out of the computer.
Thank you so much again, Emma, and also Michelle and Haneen and the Royal Anthropological Institute, and everyone for having come and discussed and asked questions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maria, again. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you,
It was a
Haneen and
pleasure
Amanda
to
and
be
the
here.
RAI.
Yeah.
And we're now going to close this session, everyone. So thank you for coming.